Tēnā koutou, good afternoon everybody, and yes, welcome to our discussion on Digital New Zealand in the Asia Pacific. Fantastic topic. As you've heard, my name is Tonie Moyes. Like many of you, I work in the New Zealand technology sector. I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer of an insurtech company called Montu, and I'm also involved in work with a number of other technology companies and organisations, one of which is very relevant to our discussion today, and that's the ABAC Business Advisory Council, where I'm the co-chair of the Digital Working Group. So this session is going to be a game of two halves. First up, I'm just going to be talking and sharing some information with you about the business environment we experience here in the Asia Pacific through the lens of Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC. I'll talk about the work of the APEC Business Advisory Council, which is a gathering of senior business leaders appointed from around the region to advise APEC heads of state about the needs of business. APEC and ABAC have a very wide economic and increasingly social and environmental agenda, but I'm going to focus on some of the key digital business topics currently on that agenda. And we're going to reach that sort of halfway mark of our session in about 20 minutes time, depending on how I go. For the second half, I'll be turning over to digital trade expert Stephanie Honey, who you've also already heard for, and she'll be facilitating our panel discussion. That's together with Mitchell Pham, who I'm sure is very well known to many of you, not only as the chair of the Digital Council of Aotearoa, but also as a board member of NZ Tech and several other business organisations. He's also an entrepreneur, co-founder of Ogun Software in New Zealand and Vietnam, drawing on his strengths as a Vietnamese Kiwi business and social entrepreneur. And we're also delighted to have with us Mark Talbot. Mark is New Zealand's APEC senior official. So he's our senior diplomat for New Zealand and APEC. He's an extensive diplomatic career representing New Zealand's foreign, trade and development interests with postings around the world. And as Steph pointed out, we really would love your questions for this part of the session, so we encourage you to fire those through to us using the Zoom chat. Okay, so I'd like to briefly explain what APEC and ABAC are about. APEC is a group of 21 countries stretching from Russia down through North and Southeast Asia, through Australia and New Zealand, and then right across the Pacific to members in both North and South America. The only major economy in the region that is not part of APEC is India. And APEC is often called an incubator of ideas. It's a chance for the member economies to come together and discuss shared challenges, both in domestic economic policy and also in the trading environment. It's not a place where binding legal agreements get negotiated, and perhaps because of that, it's actually easier to talk and has often served as the birthplace of clever trade and economic reform ideas. Malaysia is currently the chair of APEC, and that's a mantle which New Zealand is taking over next year. That's a fantastic opportunity for New Zealand to lead and influence the agenda of the region. And it will also be the first year that APEC is hosted entirely virtually, which of course underscores the importance of digital connectivity in our region. You're most likely to notice APEC towards the end of each year, where typically, although not next year, leaders of the 21 APEC economies will gather in person for a photo op in the national dress of the host nation. But rest assured that businesses, officials, ministers are working year-round on an ongoing economic agenda. As you all know, the Asia Pacific is vitally important. It's the most dynamic and rapidly growing region in the world. Home to 38% of the global population, Asia Pacific is responsible for nearly half of global trade and 60% of global GDP. It's also home to the world's three largest economies, the US, China, and Japan. So the fortunes of APEC mean a great deal to New Zealand. The 20 other economies account for nearly 3/4 of our exports, 70% of our imports, and they include 14 out of the top 20 of our trading partners. In addition, 18 out of our 19 free trade agreements are with other APEC economies, and that's really testament to what this forum can do for strengthening the relationships between economies, often leading to further and more formal relationships coming out of that. For a progressive trading nation, APEC has really been a place where New Zealand has had an influential voice about what happens in the Asia Pacific, and by virtue of that, in the global economy. So within the universe of APEC, there is ABAC. ABAC is the voice of business for APEC. It is made up of business people representing each of the 21 member economies, and we're mandated by national leaders to advise them on priority issues for the business community, but also the contribution that business can make. ABAC is very much concerned about ensuring that growth and prosperity are inclusive and sustainable, rather than just pursuing economic growth per se. My colleagues in the ABAC New Zealand team are Rachel Taulele, who is the CEO of Māori-owned food and beverage company Kono, and Malcolm Johns, CEO of Christchurch International Airport, and we're pictured here with the current ABAC chair from Malaysia. So we're here to represent you this year, also next year when New Zealand takes over leadership of ABAC also. Rachel will be chairing the organisation, and beyond that too, as this is a long-term agenda that we're working on. So, as members of the business community or the policy community or wherever you're from, why care about this? Of course, the ability to have a healthy regional economy is always crucial for business, but right now, there are a real mix of challenges facing the region and also opportunities which business people really ought to care about. No prizes for guessing what the first one is. The COVID-19 pandemic has really shown us the countless disruptions to trade that come with a health and economic crisis that is just this widespread. There have been all sorts of physical barriers to trade which businesses and governments have been overcoming: broken supply chains, restricted movement of goods, the inability to move people around, just to name a few. And moreover, in times of economic hardship, we do sometimes see that stimulating an impulse towards greater national protectionism than we might otherwise see, and ultimately that is counterproductive. We know from previous crises like the GFC that we know of the importance of international trade in stimulating economic recovery. And of course, it's also extremely essential in a crisis like this, where we must keep medical supplies and skills moving to reach those in need. It's really important that organisations like APEC and ABAC are redoubling their efforts to keep markets open. One of the few silver linings is that the pandemic has massively accelerated digital transformation for business and is playing a key role in keeping trade going. And digital can really help to future-proof our trade flows and mitigate the worst impacts of future crises. So, even before COVID, this was a difficult time for global trade. It's no secret that trade and economic tensions between the United States and China are having very widespread ripple effects, and these differences certainly extend into the tech sector, and that's a serious problem given the leading role that these two digital giants play. And that dispute is just one of many factors challenging international institutions like the WTO, which at the moment is lacking strong political support and leadership to ensure that global trade rules remain predictable, fair, and relevant to our modern economy. So, for instance, we've seen disruption towards the WTO's work on a set of rules that are really applicable in the age of digital trade. I won't go into detail on that right now, but suffice to say, for a small trade-dependent nation like New Zealand, this is not good news. Next, we have, the rapid digital transformation of the economy, which is continuing to accelerate, including through the adoption of technologies like cloud, AI, Internet of Things, 5G throughout the region. These offer massive promise, but can also be hindered when regulatory regimes struggle to keep up. The greatest benefits of digital technology will really come as we have greater cooperation and integration across the region to fully leverage the power that these have, but there are barriers and concerns that remain. Of course, it's difficult to know how we go about counterbalancing the dominance of the tech giants, which still goes relatively unchecked here in the Asia Pacific, and to answer questions about how we'll arrive at fair regimes for things like taxation, competition, small businesses, data privacy, security. The list goes on. These are really big question marks, and they very much link to the challenge of creating economic well-being that is more equal and inclusive for everyone in our region. Economic and social inequality has visibly spilled over into civil unrest in several ABAC economies in recent years, and that's underpinned by the fact that our economic system has to do more, and business has to do more, to serve and empower groups such as women, Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, rural communities, small business, startup business. And alongside that, certainly last but not least, is climate change and more broadly environmental sustainability. Arguably, this is the biggest issue of all. Thankfully, it's now rising to greater prominence in international economic groups like APEC. And there's real opportunity here for business leadership to create win-win outcomes. For instance, an all number of big topics, one of them being the transition to renewable energy, which is an ABAC theme this year. So against this background, ABAC is pursuing its vision for a seamless, dynamic, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable economic community. Now, I'm not going to linger on all of the priorities under that. They are indeed very broad and capture a great deal, but I am looking forward to chatting further about those, perhaps with Mitchell and Mark, if people are interested in asking questions. What I would like to do now is focus on a selection of specifically digital issues which are currently prominent in ABAC. So one of those is around the free flow of data across borders. Data, of course, is the lifeblood of modern business. It's increasing the knowledge intensity of the global value chains that we participate in, and it's really fueling and empowering so many of the digital technologies that are transforming all industries. According to McKinsey, the global contribution of data flows to GDP growth nearly equaled that of traditional physical goods and services over the last decade, and that trend is only going in one direction. We know that access to data and e-commerce platforms are extremely important for inclusive growth, with micro, small, and medium-sized businesses doing more than 95% of their exports on such data-enabled platforms, and a great deal of their domestic business as well. Cross-border data flows are therefore essential to the health of our firms and the regional economy, but equally they do need to happen in a way that protects against social harms. We are seeing restrictions on data flows indeed growing, both in their number and how restrictive they are. And Steph, if we could have the next slide so we can see that trend. Research conducted for ABAC by the Brookings Institute shows that the reasons behind this include privacy, cybersecurity, financial regulation, but also the desire to protect local industry and to protect prevailing social and cultural norms. And things done under the auspices of protecting legitimate interests can easily become a bit more restrictive than necessary, or even slip into protectionism, creating barriers for business. So, for example, many smaller businesses face a disproportionate cost when they're asked to spin up data centres in countries in order to meet local data locality requirements. And that's an issue which is expensive for the business, but might not do too much at all, if anything at all, to protect the underlying data security concerns that are, held up as the reason for doing such a thing. In addition, even subtle differences between the rules governing data use in each country mean that businesses can face increased compliance costs in every market in which they operate. So ABAC has been advocating strongly and building up the evidence base for ways to make what could be a regional sort of soup or noodle bowl of rules into a system that is more coherent and interoperable. Ideally, in the future, might be a great deal more harmonised. So we've got one consistent set of rules, at least to shoot for. We're also really encouraging leaders of the APEC economies to invest in infrastructure, to invest in skills, open government data, and to support businesses that do the work in the domain of making data more widely available to firms in order that they can create new technology and understand their market opportunities. Okay, another focus area is building a supportive environment in the Asia Pacific to allow new technologies to really contribute as much as they can in our region. And this touches on some of the technologies that I mentioned before, things like artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, 5G rollout, even technologies that have been around for quite some time, like the cloud, can be considered frontier technologies from the perspective of government and regulation. And governments, typically find it difficult to keep up, and this can lead to a bit of a gap where you've got business going off in one direction, but perhaps inadequate levels of investment and support for those technologies on the economic agenda, and perhaps at the same time a lack of groundwork and ensuring that there's good protection in place and that the public's trust is safeguarded. I'm going to touch on AI as just one example of this. From a regulatory perspective, this is very much a frontier technology. All APEC economies tend to have some kind of statement or principles that are guiding at a very high level around AI, mostly around focusing on ethical use. But there really is no comprehensive or consistent or very clear rules about how this is going to be governed, or mutual conviction about precisely what would be needed anyway. In contrast, in the business world, we know that AI is already playing a hugely significant role in business in every single APEC economy and transforming virtually every industry, from agriculture to healthcare to entertainment, you name it. So the work we're doing in ABAC, again, is to advocate that there's a supportive environment for AI and other technologies so that it is receiving adequate attention on the economic agenda, but also proactively working to ensure public trust in AI is fostered through the appropriate application of ethics, transparency, data protection, and the like. This is yet another area where we're seeking cooperation between APEC member economies to create coherence and contributing significant research to support the case for this work and make sure that good decisions are made. Okay, and finally, I'm going to touch on a couple of the key digital themes within APEC and ABAC that have even more strongly come to attention because of COVID-19. The first of those is investment in digital infrastructure and digital skills. We're living in a time right now where governments the world over are pouring money into the economy, and they want to do so in a way that will ultimately strengthen their economies and societies. And ABAC is advocating strongly that a lot of this money is going into areas such as digital infrastructure and digital connectivity, as well as nurturing the human capital needed to promote digitally driven business growth that's coming through education, through training and support for entrepreneurships, digital startups and the like. We know that digital infrastructure is an area where all APEC economies can do better, and it has got the potential to drive a great deal of positive change. For instance, we know that broadband penetration is one of the metrics that's linked very strongly to the improvement of GDP per capita, and is also fundamental to getting currently underserved groups into a place where they've got greater economic power and access and the ability to start their own businesses, reach financial services, and all of those sorts of things. It also really helps our businesses and supply chains to be smarter and more sustainable in everything we do. And yet there remains a significant digital divide driven largely by infrastructure, even in countries like New Zealand. Our own Productivity Commission, together with the Australians, has pointed out that digital infrastructure can do a lot more to support a productive economy here. We do have some fantastic digital infrastructure, like our fibre network, but we fall short when it comes to digital infrastructure for payments, for trade, for broadband in rural areas, and digital government infrastructure. And that's without even starting to look at areas such as 5G and cloud computing centres, where we're significantly behind a lot of areas of the world. And on top of that, we have trouble developing enough skills to really help us unlock the potential of this part of the economy. Another area that is really key in the COVID-19 response is applying digitally enabled technologies to all elements of the international pandemic response. ABAC has been in very frequent dialogue with ministers and leaders and is urging that governments work together to ensure that technologies such as telemedicine, contact tracing and therapies are as highly effective and widely available as possible, that we are digitally ensuring that trade remains open through enabling supply chains and trade, that commerce can keep moving, essential medical supplies can keep flowing. To this end, we are seeking to accelerate specific innovations relating to e-commerce, to electronic signatures, to e-services, electronic IDs, and all, a real menu of innovations that can unlock further potential and an ability to work together even under this crisis type circumstances. And very sadly, this is not likely to be our last pandemic, and it's certainly not going to be our last crisis. So the work that is being done now is both to help accelerate the recovery from the crisis that we're currently facing, but also to make the regional economy much more resilient into the future. Okay, so I've traversed quite a wide area in a short period of time. I'm talking very fast, but I hope it's clear that through digital cooperation in the Asia Pacific, much can be achieved for our businesses here and to improve lives and better protect the environment. So before I hand over to Steph for the panel discussion, I just want to end by saying that ABAC New Zealand, that's Rachel, Malcolm and myself, exist so that the voice of New Zealand business can be heard by the leaders of the 21 APEC economies, and we really welcome you to reach out to us, and we're looking forward, together with the New Zealand business community, to hosting the APEC Business Advisory Council through the platform of New Zealand in 2021. Okay, thanks Steph, that ends the presentation, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tonie. That was a great presentation that has given a perfect entree now to this very impressive panel that we've pulled together for this event. So if I could invite Mark and Mitchell now to unmute your microphones, we'll engage with the three of our excellent speakers for the day. And if I may, I'd like to start with you, Mitchell. Now, as Tonie mentioned in her introduction of you, you are the chair of the Digital Council of Aotearoa, and the council is currently looking at a range of important issues, including digital inclusion, the ethical use of technology. In fact, quite a number of the points that Tonie has mentioned, ABAC is looking at. Your global thought leadership in this space has also recently been recognised with your invitation to join the Asia Society's Global Council. So drawing on those different work streams, what in your view are some of the key priorities to make the Asia Pacific a region where New Zealand businesses can really thrive?
So just unmuting my microphone. Thank you, Stephanie. Kia ora, everyone. I think taking a step back, what I, as well as the rest of our Digital Council team, are seeing is that our economic recovery is really going to be relying on being digital led, and this is the same across the Asia Pacific region as well. And we're fortunate that we can start on this journey than many, but being a traditionally export-led nation, we will need really to actually recover alongside others in the region. And the fact that the regional economies are going to be focusing increasingly more and more on digital and tech and digital recovery is a real opportunity for New Zealand to be a part of all that. And I think being a part of all that is actually the key. We are already kind of present in this region as part of the region, but we need to be present in the conversation. We really need to engage with what's really going on, what's being discussed, what's being explored, what's being looked into as the different economies across the region start to try and get into that recovery mode and start to see that digital led is kind of the way to go. So the kind of the three things that the Digital Council are keen to ensure is that New Zealand, in this case Digital Council, through some of these relationships, is that we are actually part of, or can even lead some of the regional conversations on topical digital issues such as the digital inclusion or the ethical use of technology. But also, secondly, having access to knowledge and experience and resources that other countries have actually and have developed along the way that can actually share with us. And then also, where possible, look at opportunities for the New Zealand Digital Council to collaborate with our counterparts across the Asia Pacific region, so that we can learn and from learning apply the results back here in our own journey.
Well, thank you very much, Mitchell. If I could bring you in now, Mark. I mean, we've heard two very strong business perspectives on the importance of the conversation. APEC is sometimes the acronym is sometimes explained as a perfect excuse for a conversation, so we're in the right ballpark. But what do you, as our New Zealand senior officials, see as some of the priorities for APEC next year as we turn to this hosting responsibility?
Thanks, Steph, and thanks to Tonie and to Mitchell as well. It's always a tough act to have to follow two people from the business community who actually know about making money, and it's an even tougher act to follow when we're talking about digital, which is an area that I'm sure most officials feel a little bit uncomfortable in. But Steph, you asked about what's going to matter next year when New Zealand is chairing APEC in 2021. And I think some of the contextual pieces have really already been touched on. First of all, what's happening out there in the wider global economy is probably the biggest economic slump in recorded history. Time will tell, of course, but it could be that bad. The IMF has predicted a 5% fall in the size of the global economy, with tens of millions of people becoming unemployed and potentially up to 100 million people falling back into extreme poverty. So some of the sort of the trends that we've seen economically over the last few years going into reverse. And some of the traditional tools that government has used are not necessarily there anymore. So, for example, inflation is at all-time lows, which makes it hard to stimulate economies through monetary policy. So economies are having to look differently at some of the economic challenges. And one of the solutions is clearly going to be a digitally enabled recovery. And we need to be talking in APEC about that. And I guess that takes me to the second big change that we're seeing coming out of COVID-19, which is going to inform our host year in a big way, which is, of course, that, previously we talked about digital and the importance of digital, the importance of e-commerce. The pandemic has really made that real and really significantly accelerated the digital economy's significance for all of us. I think I saw a statistic the other day that suggested that in the United States, during the course of the pandemic, the use of telemedicine had increased by 8,000%, which is quite remarkable when you think about that is just one sector of the economy in the United States and the way in which it's changed. So we can really foresee three big conversations in APEC next year, and we will be leading them and driving them. One is about how we keep markets open and prevent economies from sort of resorting to some of the bigger thy neighbour policies that we saw that made the situation that much worse during the Great Depression. And that'll be about multilateral trade through the World Trade Organization, as Tonie's mentioned, and also regional economic integration initiatives. The second big area that I expect will be part of the conversation next year is how do we promote sustainable and inclusive growth? The one thing that we know about economic crises is that marginalised groups are hardest hit. Women, young people, Indigenous people. How do we make sure that some of the really sort of painful parts of the economic downturn are not felt exclusively by those groups? And equally, how do we make sure that we're taking advantage of this crisis to grow in a more sustainable direction? And then the third area, which I think will be of most interest to this audience, is really how do we harness digital as a new source of economic recovery for the Asia Pacific region? APEC has talked for years about digital and the importance of going digital, and New Zealand is actually going to take APEC digital by hosting a wholly virtual year in 2021. And we've really got to get down to the nub of some of those critical issues that Tonie in particular talked about around some of the rules that govern digital trade, data localization requirements, for example. Some of the reforms that economies can adopt that will make their digital economies more competitive, supporting telecommunication services, for example. Some of the internet governance issues that are very, very real. We talk a lot about privacy rules and how they might function most effectively. And then tackling some of the digital divide issues. I think I saw a statistic recently that suggested 60% of the Asia Pacific's population is online, but 40% of it isn't. So, how do we close that gap, and how do we ensure that people have the skills that are preparing them for the digital economy rather than the old economy? Steph, I might just stop there to keep the discussion going.
Thank you very much, Mark. That is a really great insight into APEC's work. If I could also just talk to the audience for a moment to say, please don't hold back from, thinking of your own questions as we go through this panel discussion. If you use the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, we would love to get some of your questions to put to this illustrious group as well. But Tonie, maybe if I could bring you in now. You mentioned in your presentation the importance of AI, including issues like, ethical principles for the use of AI and the value and consistency across the region. Could we maybe talk on that a little bit? And I'd like to bring in both Mark and Mitchell on this as well subsequently. But maybe if you could lead us off, what do you see as some of the opportunities, but also the risks for New Zealand businesses in AI in the Asia Pacific region?
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I mean, I think firstly, it's important to recognise that it would be rare to identify a New Zealand business right now that is not in some way, shape or form a beneficiary of artificial intelligence, whether that means that they are directly applying it with people working in that domain themselves. Many are, but also we're benefiting from this through service providers, through the supply chain, upstream and downstream. And this is just the kind of technology we want to leverage. We have to leverage, in fact, to remain competitive in the region, but also is going to allow us to be more productive and more value adding in the firms and in the type of business that we're doing. It really is one of the key tools that we have to deploy. I was just thinking, I'm sitting here in Wellington today, and some of the most innovative firms and successful firms that we're seeing around here have got AI really at the heart. So actually through ABAC earlier this week, or last week, sorry, I heard from Ralph Hyman, who is the CEO of Volpara Healthcare, whether AI is at the centre of their business, which is breast imaging to improve the detection of breast cancer. Here in our film industry, a lot of AI is now being deployed, by those magicians at Weather Digital. They're really creating a high value industry here. Firms like Xero are using AI to help small businesses to get much more automated and easier to access cash forecasting. It really is coming through in every industry, including every New Zealand industry, including ones that we think of as quite traditional, like horticulture. Now, I did already, I think, touch on quite a few of those barriers that we're facing to this in the region. Things like, the kind of a proliferation of rules that might not really match up, and not just rules relating to AI, but also to the data, which is sort of the kind of the life force to make it all work anyway, especially deep learning, machine learning, all of that good stuff. We've got those challenges that there are certain firms that really have captured a lot of the data, and some of the big ethical and commercial questions around to what extent should that be shared, how are people protected in terms of the use of their data, and how do we have enough transparency about what's going on in AI so that we can really understand what decisions are being made on our behalf. How do we make sure that there's not unconscious bias built in there? A whole raft of issues. In addition to that, something that New Zealand firms tend to face, and actually a lot of economies in the Asia Pacific region, is actually generating the right kind of skills in our economy to make sure that we can fully take advantage of that. And that's something that we frequently hear reported from New Zealand businesses. How do we develop the expertise here, whether it's from people coming in, through training ourselves? And I think, of course, the more we have firms doing this and applying it in practice, that's when you really see that flywheel of development happening. So excited to see more of that in New Zealand in years to come.
Great, thank you very much, Tonie. Well, Mitchell, Tonie's talked about this idea of trying to grow our own domestic capability in AI. It sounds as though it's already in a pretty thriving state, but I know that the Digital Council has been doing some work in this space as well. How important is this, would you say, within the domestic economy, and what are some of the answers there?
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. So from the Digital Council's perspective, the digital and data-driven technology is actually a very, very broad topic. It covers a very expansive landscape going forward in front of us. And so part of kind of what we are focusing on this year is called automated decision making. And AI is part of a subset of automated decision making. And the reason we see the automated decision making, or ADM, is so important is because alongside AI and other technologies, this particular aspect of how data is used and how systems are implemented and how decisions are being made, that affect the daily lives of all New Zealanders. It's a very important topic, and the Digital Council has a 3 years kind of a working program that we focus on 3 high-level topics or themes, if you will. This year's focus on trust, next year's focus on inclusion, and the following year is on innovation. And in terms of trust, we find that trust in digital technology and having the ability to maintain, to build, to gain, but also to maintain that trust, to being trustworthy, of consumers or customers in terms of technology, really greatly impact the automated decision-making topic, right? Because it touches just all of our lives, from government services right through to commercial offerings. It is a very pervasive kind of a topic. And so over the course of this year, we are doing some significant research to kind of develop some evidence-based type of insight that we can advise governments around this topic, but we can also share with the public more about trust and trustworthiness in automated decision making. And I think that's going to align really well with industry as well as government advancing AI and other related technology to provide better and more efficient and more effective services to consumers and citizens.
Very, very compelling words there. Mark, does that resonate with what you think New Zealand or the broader APEC sort of governance group might be trying to achieve next year? Is AI likely to be one of the sort of key areas of focus?
Well, actually, what I was just reflecting on, Steph, is that this is one of APEC's advantages as an international institution, is that businesses specifically inside the organisation and a specific participant, and as your audience will know, government is usually behind the 8 ball on a lot of these things, and needs business to be telling us what is happening at the bleeding edge of technology. So actually getting business into APEC and working with us is really helpful, and that's why it's great to have people like Tonie Moyes on the APEC Business Advisory Council. But a lot of the issues that have been mentioned are absolutely on APEC's agenda. A lot of the issues around supporting AI are there. You've got data issues in particular front and centre, as well as privacy and some of those ethical issues.
Thank you, Mark. Now, we've had a question from the audience, which I think I'm going to have to throw in your direction as well, Mark. But before we get to that, maybe I could just sort of round out the APEC part of the conversation by touching on another area that both Tonie and Mitchell have mentioned, around cross-border data flows. As Tonie, I think you described it as the sort of the life force or the lifeblood of the digital economy. For either of you, Tonie or Mitchell, what are some of the barriers that we're starting to see to cross-border data flows? How important is this, and what can be done about it?
I might jump in, Tonie, if that's okay.
Fine.
I think cross-border data flows is a very interesting area of work, and it's fundamentally because of the differences. Every country has cultures that kind of shape what they believe in terms of data ownership and also data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is kind of easy. It's kind of just sovereignty within the domain, but data ownership is much more complex. I'll use an example. So in New Zealand, we believe that the data that is about us are owned by us individuals, right? And that's what we believe. In countries like Vietnam, for example, citizens believe that the data is owned by the state. It is the state's responsibility. So there's that deference to the state, as opposed to having the right to own your own individual data. And neither countries is wrong when you look at the cultural context. You know, New Zealand is a very individualistic society, and Vietnam is a very collectivistic society. You know, and so it's how do you kind of connect both of very, very different culture to kind of work out the ownership of data before you can apply regulations and a whole bunch of other things that will govern cross-border data movements. And that's just one of many examples, right? And I'll give you another example, what the difference is. In New Zealand, when we go to hospitals, we then subsequently make insurance claims, for example. Well, there's data sharing between the hospital and the health insurer. But in countries like Vietnam, again, just the same example, the hospital believes that they own the data and they don't have to share with the health insurers. And so what happens is you know, health insurers get overcharged by the hospitals and up the premium, and the consumers lose. You know, and so it requires a very different approach in different countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's something interesting to just sort of add here. One of the realities, even though we're seeing restrictions increase both in number and I guess in intensity across the region, you know, the reality of the internet is that most electronic data flows are cross-border flows. Even if they start in one country and ultimately their destination is in the same country, they're naturally moving all over the place. And I think to connect with what Mitchell has said, you know, we can take different perspectives on who's responsible for data, who owns it. I think that the question that we need to challenge ourselves to answer as a region is that, you know, almost regardless of who owns it, how do we liberate and also govern data so that we can solve questions for our people and for our economy that data empowers us to do? Where is it right to be connected up? So, you know, if we can achieve a more efficient and effective healthcare system through data while also protecting privacy and rights, but perhaps not creating monopolies and fiefdoms over data, you know, tend to think that that could be you know, really a principle that could steer us in the right direction.
Clearly a very rich area for one of those great APEC conversations. I saw Mark taking a careful note of the comments there. Now, just a quick reminder to the audience, please do send us your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'd love to, you know, get this group to talk about what's on your mind. But if I might pick up one of the questions that we've received and turning to you, Mark, somebody has asked, what is the New Zealand government already doing in digital? I heard about Deeper. Mark, tell us, what on earth is Deeper?
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks very much for the question. I'm not going to pretend to be the world's expert on Deeper because I didn't actually negotiate it, but I can tell you a little bit about it. So the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement is something that New Zealand, Chile and Singapore agreed to recently and in fact have signed, and it will be going through each of our respective ratification processes. And it's really intended to be a little bit of a sort of a pathfinder, if you like, for how rules in the region can be created to govern the digital economy, or to, you know, to ensure that it's as easy as possible to do business digitally between our economies. And, you know, New Zealand, Chile and Singapore have a little bit of a history here. Our three countries, together with Brunei Darussalam, were sort of at the very heart of what has become CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big mega FTA in the Asia-Pacific region. So, you know, if you follow that history, one might imagine that in 20 years' time, Deeper might provide the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement might provide a basis for a region-wide understanding of rules to govern the digital economy. Deeper is made up of a series of modules that cover different issue areas, and those include data issues, privacy, the location of data facilities, trust issues. So, for example, dealing with consumer protection, dealing with spam. It's got a provision related to cyber security. It's got provisions on digital identities, and it also talks about emerging trends and technologies in the digital space. So artificial intelligence, which Mitchell and Tonie were just speaking so cogently about, fintech, etc., etc. So it will be a living agreement, if you like, and it will continue to evolve to seek to respond to the new challenges of the digital economy. The final thing I'd just say on it, Stephanie, is it's open for accession by other WTO members, so hopefully it will grow over time.
Thanks very much, Mark. I was just going to ask if others could join, but you know, maybe one day we might see all the APEC economies docking on. Maybe not, given some of the comments that we've heard today about different perspectives on digital trade, but that would certainly be very positive for the New Zealand business community. Now, I have another question here, which I open the floor to any of you to answer, but the question is this. One of the benefits of hosting international meetings is the opportunity for international arrivals to spur the economy. How will New Zealand, especially business, but perhaps also tourism agencies, manage the expectation of having virtual meetings all year? Now, obviously, Mark, we'd love to get your insights from a government perspective, but I might turn to Tonie first of all and tell us how you see the virtual ABAC working next year.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steph, and thanks to the audience for the question. Mitchell, I'm sure you've got some views to share on this as well. You know, hosting an entirely virtual APEC year is certainly different, and you're absolutely right to identify that, you know, traditionally we would be using the opportunity of hosting a physical meeting in New Zealand to bring leaders here, to bring business leaders here also, and to really showcase what New Zealand, what the New Zealand economy has to offer and create opportunities that way. Working in a digital context, we've got to find new ways of doing that. There are some disadvantages, but there are also advantages, and we've got business groups working together with organisations like Tourism New Zealand, which is really expert at showcasing New Zealand, as well as New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, to work on initiatives that we can actually showcase what is going on here in New Zealand through our virtual forums that we'll have running. One of the benefits of operating virtually is that rather than just focus everything around 1 week at the end of the year and only reaching those people that are able to travel all the way to New Zealand in person, is that we can reach a much wider audience. And I guess throughout the last 4 or 5 months, we've really seen an acceleration in technologies that can support us to do this, and as well as sort of a skills and knowledge base growing through all sorts of international conferences and the like, to try to make us effective in doing that. So we will be trying to leverage some of those star attractions that we've got. We'll be hosting a virtual CEOs summit alongside APEC, so really engaging business leaders in what New Zealand has to offer, and also some of the issues that we really care about. One of the themes that we'll be focusing on is Indigenous business and taking the opportunity to showcase New Zealand's strength through the Māori economy, and also using the leaders of our various economies to engage in a direct dialogue with business leaders. And we think that that's going to be an opportunity to have people really want to be with us through a virtual platform. Mitchell, do you have anything to add?
Or actually, if maybe we could, oh yeah, go ahead, Mitchell.
Oh, okay. Just a little bit, really. I think Tonie's kind of outlined the key things there. But I think that ultimately, if we bring very sophisticated technologies to help to help develop a very engaging year-long kind of range of activities that connect governments and businesses and leaders and CEOs, and just like this week is TechWeek, and for the first time it's digital only, and it's made TechWeek events open and accessible right across New Zealand, but also for international attendees to attend. And in September, I'm also involved with the ASEAN Business Alliance, and again this year the annual conference is going fully digital as well. And suddenly there's a much broader scope to engage a much wider audience with much more sophisticated technologies that we have today, and will continue to that technology will continue to advance very rapidly because of the global demand for that. So I think we can do a lot more than we used to with in-person events. Although we are losing some of the traditional benefits of having visitors in person in New Zealand.
As always in the tech world, disruption is not necessarily a bad thing. But Mark, over to you for the last word.
Thanks, Steph. I mean, just very quickly, I agree with much of what Mitchell and Tonie have already said, but a few points. One is that, of course, the fact that we're hosting APEC virtually was imposed on us rather than something that we've chosen. COVID-19 travel restrictions have effectively made it the only viable planning proposition for us, and therefore we're having to do it. But that also comes with an advantage, which is that we actually have a bit of a runway to try to make this as successful as possible. And I think there are signs already that you can get the business done digitally. The Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that I was just talking about was negotiated remotely. And I think also, as Tonie said, you can actually be much more inclusive. You can have many more people phoning in from capital. So there are advantages. But Mitchell mentioned the use of sophisticated technology, and there are a couple of hurdles that we're going to have to overcome that might mean we won't be able to do meetings in the way that have been done traditionally. So, if you think about it, I think something like 70% of communication is non-verbal. How do you surmount that challenge when people are not in the same room? We're going to have to think carefully about that. The other big challenge is that most APEC meetings are like any conference. They kind of run from 8 a.m. in the morning till late at night. That's not possible when you've got people spread across 16 different time zones. So we're going to have to think about doing things entirely differently, and we're sort of interested in creative ideas that will help us sort of navigate through this. We haven't got all the answers yet, Steph, but we're thinking really hard about it.
Well, there are some pretty impressive tech thinkers on this call. So there you go, audience. The gauntlet has been laid down. Come up with some brilliant disruptions to make APEC and ABAC 2021 rip-roaring success. And with that, it's 5 o'clock. I know people have probably got lots more fantastic Tech Week events to get to. So I'd like to bring things to a close by thanking most warmly Tonie Moyes from Montu and ABAC New Zealand, Mark Talbot, APEC New Zealand Senior Official, and Mitchell Pham, Chair of the Digital Council of Aotearoa. Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. Look forward to many more. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Steph.
Thank you, Steph. Bye, everyone.
Bye.